figure out what the real issues are, and we haven't done that.
Right, and that is a huge threat. Now, very briefly on the North Korea issue, I mean, do you see this as evidence of diplomacy working, or do you think it's just...
Well, look, I don't think it's, I think it's one of those things is wishful thinking. The North Koreans, the Hermit Kingdom, have always been about one thing, regime survival. As long as you understand that, you understand everything else they do. I think this is one more time that we're going to try to get them to do something they don't want to do, and it's a sham, honestly.
So you don't think they're actually going to
I don't think so. No, they're not going to give it up. But then again, they've been contained for the past, since '54.
Right.
Nothing tells me they're going to change that anytime soon. So.
And, well, very briefly, those who think that diplomacy doesn't work are pointing to Iran, for example, as an area where perhaps a military strike would be in order, or at least a supportive strike with Israel. I want to bring into the discussion the role of the media.
Yeah.
We've talked about sort of the revolving door between generals and who are hired as these dispassionate on-air analysts, still serve either Pentagon interests or defense contractor interests. Glenn Greenwald of Salon had a great piece about a general who has been briefing NBC executives essentially about the imminent threat of Iran. How does this kind of thing affect diplomacy? I mean, affect foreign policy?
These generals come in, and a lot of these guys, I'm going to be very blunt here, as soon as they get their stars, they check their brain at the door, and they become part of the system which they came up through. The general you're talking about, I believe, reflects that. General McKean over at Fox is saying, McCaffrey, Keane, a lot of these guys will say whatever they're being told to say and have no ability to think for themselves. And that's part of the problem with the process. Don't get me wrong, there are generals out there, personal friends of mine, who do think, who will say what's on their mind. But you have others who are actually engaged in this information operations, if you will, of trying to convince people things which aren't necessarily true or aren't in our country's best interest.
It doesn't seem to be working. I mean, what was that Pew poll that found that 58% of Americans would support a military strike against Iran if sanctions failed? I mean, our worldview is essentially reflecting these kinds of ideas.
And I think that's part of the problem. Let me just tell you about the blatant fact. The fact is you would have to take over 300 sorties, that is aircraft missions, to hit just the known sites within Iran. So where do we go from there? What's next? So we've got to be careful about how we do this. I'm not saying that there isn't not a threat. I think there are elements within the Iranian government which would like to see something, but there's a rational side as well. They're not a monolithic threat, and that's why I believe we should actually try to encourage the Iranian people, the Persians, to rise up against their government, since they're not happy with the government either. But democratic change is ultimately the answer there, not bombing them back to the Stone Age.
But don't you think the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing out of, for example, our presidential hopefuls, some people in the political leadership, could essentially unify a country that feels like it's under attack? I mean, that's going to have the opposite effect.
Absolutely. I've said this on your network. I've said it on another network, too, that the more we poke them, the more their central government can see, we have enemies out there, you people need to be with us, and therefore we help codify that government and the people standing behind it. We would do the same thing here in the United States. If someone started taking shots at us, the Americans, we would form around the government and support it. This is one of the things we tend to forget about the fact if we do it to others, they're going to have the same effect of helping that government maintain control. Absolutely.
And one other thing that I want to get into, I mean, the new budget proposal makes it very clear that we're sort of shifting away from our focus on Iraq and our focus on Afghanistan, even though we're still expanding our bases and jails there, but that's a different conversation. Right. What kind of a void does that leave? I mean, Afghanistan is, by all metrics, a failure in terms of our mission,
despite
whatever the mission
is. The basic premise is this. They went in there to do counterinsurgency, which is basically to establish the conditions for the people to support the central government. What we've seen instead is us pushing the people towards a corrupt central government. They know it, and we give them a Hobson's choice. Either take the central government that's corrupt or the Taliban. Well, most people are picking the Taliban. That's why you saw 7 days of uprisings against us and the Karzai. We are a proxy of the Karzai. So the best thing we can do is this: accept the fact that we're not going to bring a 10th century people into the 21st century first. Secondly, the Karzai is corrupt. Let him sink or swim on his own. Third, the real issue has been, always has been, President Obama said it in his West Point speech 3 years ago, Pakistan. The Pakistanis still control the Taliban. I can tell you for a fact they do.
There's been recent reports.
Yes, and so another general, a good friend of mine, did a review in country recently and said the Taliban don't have sufficient mass to take over Afghanistan without the help of the Pakistanis. So the truth is we have to be focusing on Pakistan, plus Pakistanis have nuclear weapons. So all roads lead to Pakistan. Afghanistan should be left alone. We can do what's necessary there with Special Operations Forces. We don't have to be occupiers to do what we have to keep national security interests at bay, not make them more like us.
Okay, well, a lot to talk about with the Pakistani issue, so I hope we can have you back in the near future to really hone in on that. Thank you so much for your time. That was Anthony Shaffer, the Senior Fellow at the Center of Advanced Defense Studies and the author of the book Operation Dark Heart.